family history. So, what am I starting with? Like, are the original going back to the caveman? Is this going to be on the news
No.
or network or cable or
No.
anything? No? Somebody going to look at it?
I could send it to you when it's done.
No, not me. Is anybody else going to look at
My
it?
professor in my class.
Okay, well, just explain to them why I'm wearing this shirt so they don't think you pulled me out of a circus or
Well,
something.
why are you wearing that shirt?
Oh, I just came from a bike ride and I had no idea this was going to be on. Otherwise, I would have worn something more formal, which I don't have, and I would have trimmed the beard. Pretty much that's the whole family is like that, okay? We're loosey-goosey. My name is Richard Fine. I have the honor to be the grandfather of Layla Fine. And if you know me from Brooklyn, you would call me Dickie. But I have graduated to Richard over the years. Both my parents were born in Eastern Europe, where the border changed over the years. The assumption is Poland is where they were born, both in 1915. My father in a small city called Bialystok, which had been part of Russia, had been part of Poland, depends what day of the week it was. And my mother was born in Poland, in a small village that we have never been able to determine where it is, but it's near the Austrian border. Both my parents came over, Jack and Rose, by the way, came over in 1922. My mother came over with her mother and 4 of her siblings. Both my parents were, ironically, 7 years old when they came over. My mother is the youngest of, as often happens in Europe, a huge amount of births. Most of them, or only 8 of them, survived infancy. There were triplets, there were twins, and those did not survive at all. So 8 of them survived. My mother was the youngest of the 8, and the next oldest was her sister, who was a couple of years older, and then there were 6 brothers. The oldest one was over 30 years older than my mother. So that's a sobering reality. So this poor grandmother came over with my mother and my aunt and like 2 or 3 uncles, all up to young teenagers. Came over by herself because her husband had passed away in Europe from, I believe, smallpox. And they came here. The older brothers had come a few years earlier. One of them ended up a dentist. I have no idea how he ended up a dentist. I think in those days, nobody really checked credentials, but they went through Ellis Island, and they ended up going to Williamsburg. That's when one day my mother was, there was a knock at the door, and she opened the door, and there were like 2 grown men there, and my mother, being the 7-year-old immigrant kid, didn't speak English, scared, opens the door, and mama, there's people, and her mother comes over, and she says, "These are your brothers." And so they're the 2 guys, like 30 years old, 35 at that time, I guess, and older, and that was my mother. And my father, when he was 3 years old, his father was 21 at the time. They married young and they started having babies quickly. So he was 3, his father was 21. His father overnight got pneumonia and died at the age of 21. And that was it. And here was this young widow, his mother, my grandmother, at the age of like 18, I guess, 19, 20, whatever she was, and she had this little baby, and within a year or 2, she apparently met a gentleman who took a liking to her, and at that particular time, a woman with a baby is not somebody people were pursuing for marriage. My grandfather's mother, the grandfather who passed away, his mother was coming to America, and she said she would take little Jackie, my father, at the age of 7, and she would bring him to America. My father kept in contact with her through whatever mail system there was at that time until the end of the 1930s, when he lost track of her and ultimately found out that she, along with 6 million other Jews in Europe, was killed in the Holocaust. He determined that she had died. He dug up some records that she had actually died in Auschwitz, in the concentration camp. And she must have been, 40-some-odd years old. America, not being the most immigrant-friendly country at the time, was creating the Immigration Act of, it ended up to be 1923 or something like that. They said there are too many foreigners coming into the country. The biggest taboo was East European Jews, the Italians, that they really were like, hey, these people we don't need anymore coming in. So the reality of history is, if either one of my parents had waited another year to come to America, they probably never would have come to America because of this Immigration Act, and I never would have been here, and the little lady making this video wouldn't have been here, and the whole scenario would have changed. So my parents met when they were in their middle 20s, early 20s in New York City. My father, having come over with his grandmother, was living in Harlem. His grandmother had an uncle who ran a shirt factory. His father was a manager of a shirt factory in Pennsylvania in the middle of nowhere. And his father had a nice job. He was managing a factory. He knew that they were living in poverty in New York. He said, come to Pennsylvania and you can live with us and our family. And she did, and she passed away, unfortunately, a few years later. My father went to high school in Pennsylvania, and after he graduated, he wanted to kind of go out on his own. He was a hard-working guy, as most of that generation was. Didn't mind working hard, long, getting their hands dirty. And he worked in the scrap metal business. After a few years, he opened up a used plumbing supply near is the East Village, and he opened that up in probably the late 30s. After 2 or 3 or 4 years, he was starting to make money, make a profit anyway, not money. And I was born in 1942. Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, December of 1941. My father was 28 years old because they drafted him after Pearl Harbor. The law said Pearl Harbor was December of 41. If you had a baby born after September 15th, you did it on purpose to get out of the Army. I was born September 19th, and September 15th was the cutoff. So they had drafted him. I was not going to be used as an exemption. He had to sell that used plumbing supply business, and people just gave him 10 cents on the dollar. They knew he had no choice. And my mother, we were living in Brooklyn at the time in an apartment building where they were paying, I think it was like $22 a month rent for a one-bedroom apartment. And here I was about 6 months old when he got drafted and went to Europe, spent World War II in mostly France. And I never realized it until years later that my mother really had me for 3 years, and there was no dad influence, and not until I became sensitive to influences of young children and kids without dads and things like that. I go, holy cow, I was one. I never realized it. I remember the day Dad came home from the war. Every night my mother would read me a story, show me a picture of Dad. Dad came home, he had a lock of my very blonde hair in his wallet all that time. And he came through the door with a knapsack on his back and his uniform. And she said, that he came through the door, and I picture it today. I could tear up. She said, you know who that is? And I said, Daddy. And I lucked out. I had two of the best parents ever. And the older I get and the more I talk to people, and I realize how many shitty parents there are, I really lucked out. They were really decent, nice, fun people. My mother she lived with her mother even into her when she was in her 20s. Her mother was getting cancer, and my mother was a very responsible kid, took care of her mother, who passed away a couple of years before I was born. And that's why in the Jewish religion you usually name a child after a deceased relative. You know, there's Richard and Rhonda and Ronnie and Roberta and Rachel. When Dad came home from the war, he contacted one of his old customers who was a plumber. Dad had the brain and the hustle and the know-how, and he got together with this plumber and said, why don't we open a plumbing supply store? And they opened one up on the Lower East Side. Harry Margulies was Dad, the plumber, the partner. That's why it's F&M, Fine and Margulies Plumbing Supply. And we lived in Brooklyn. Dad commuted to the Lower East Side. And after a few years, they expanded because Jersey was becoming a place where people were all of a sudden moving out. Nobody ever lived on Long Island. Nobody ever lived in Jersey. But New York City was bulging out, and people were making a decent living. There was a middle class being established in America after World War II. Dad and his partner said, let's open up something in New Jersey in Cliffside Park. And Dad would commute from Brooklyn to Cliffside Park every day without a car. I remember going to work with him as a kid. He would take subway, and then there was a little ferry that went across the river, and then he would take a bus. This is to open up a plumbing supply store that opened up at 7 in the morning. So he worked his ass off. He came home late. He was tired. Finally, when I was about 9 or 10, and my sister was born 4 years after me, we moved to New Jersey, and Dad stayed in the store in Cliffside Park, and Harry stayed on the Lower East Side, and they dissolved F&M as a partnership. They just kept the names. Sherry, as I said, was born 4 years after me. Sherry and I today are really, really close, and yet I was a real shitty big brother to her. And she talked about it, we talk about it sometimes. She said, don't forget, you didn't have your father for first 3 years of your life. This guy finally comes back into your life. A year later, Sherry's born. Hey, what the hell? And so that accounted for my behavior. Sherry gave me a pass on that. Once she became a social worker and realized I wasn't as shitty as I was until I was like 14. After that, I just ignored her. My parents had another little kid 11 years after I was born. So 7 years after Sherry and Michelle was born. First of all, I spent the first 10 years of my life in Brooklyn, and everybody in my neighborhood was either Jewish or Italian, and everybody had relative, either parents in most cases, but in every case, at least the grandparents, those that had it, who were immigrants. Everybody had an accent. It was just assumed. I mean, my mother, who was not a woman of the world at that time, she just assumed the whole world was either Jewish or Italian. When we moved to New Jersey, Michelle was born in New Jersey. Now, she's 11 years younger, as I said, than me, and 7 years younger than Sherry. It was a whole different world for me and Michelle because she was too young to really pick on. And now the two closest people to me in my life, is Amy can see this? Two closest people to me in my life are my two sisters. My parents, a lot of my uncles had accents, and my aunts, because they were older. My parents, again, coming over when they were 7, no accent. But they certainly grew up. I mean, by the time I came into their life, they'd lived through a depression, certainly lots and lots and lots of poverty, which they never even acknowledged as poverty because everybody around them was scraping for food and, getting by and living paycheck to paycheck or whatever it was. And so we just didn't know it. We didn't have the television exposure to see how the other half lives, and the diversity that the world affords people to see. When I was in high school, it was just assumed I was going to go to college. I just assumed it because my father, who was one of the smartest people I knew, never had a chance to really go to college. And so I just assumed when I went to college, I just had him on my shoulder. I knew I was there for him. When I graduated, it was dramatic for me, and I was not a very dramatic kid, but it was dramatic for me realizing that I'm here because because of him, and he wasn't, and he was so proud. We moved to New Jersey to, fortunately, a very nice little town that was already established, Leonia, which is right next to Fort Lee. But it was already built up. It's not like all those city people were moving in and the new buildings going up. We just moved into a garden apartment in Leonia. And I remember when we lived in Brooklyn, we had the D train, the L, elevated train, not underground. And it was right outside our bedroom window. And that was a 24-hour-a-day things. And we just slept. I mean, we grew up with the L right out there. We went in this garden apartment. Now, Sherry was 5 and I was 9 or whatever it was. And the next day after we woke up, all of us, I remember talking about how we couldn't sleep because there was like a cricket outside or something in a garden apartment. And it was the weirdest thing. We realized a cricket's keeping us up, but a subway never woke us up at all. And when I went to school, the kids were nice. I was never bullied, but I was unique in the sense that I had this thing called a Brooklyn accent that I never knew I had because everybody was in Brooklyn that I knew. And they would gather around me, the guys would gather around me, and not to tease, but just to say, listen to this guy's talk. And they would throw words at me. They'd say Singer. Say Brooklyn. and I really had this thick accent that I didn't know I had. Sherry and I used to tease Michelle because she was born in New Jersey. We made fun of her. And we used to make her cry when she was bad. We used to babysit her. She misbehaved. Oh, that's it. We're calling the orphanage. We're going to send her back. And I get on the phone and I go, hello? Yeah, this is fine. The kid's not working out. We're going to have to send her. No. And Michelle turned out to be the biggest achiever in our family. Academically, I got the bachelor's degree. Sherry got the master's degree. She was a teacher all her life and then a social worker. And Michelle got the doctorate. She is the professor. And yet, when I say my sister's a professor, I just have to say she's the most down-to-earth, humane person, unstuffy that I know. And she's written like a dozen books. Psychology, public education. People in the academic world might know Michelle Fine. When I went away to college, it was my first time away from home. And I didn't realize I had these little weird comments or words that I used, phrases that I used, because Mom, who, even though she was fluent in English and articulate and all of that stuff, but she just had things like towel paper. And so I would say towel paper, and they go, what? Oh, paper towel. Oh, okay, who knew? I mean, everybody in my life said towel paper. And Michelle, with her doctorate, says it's funny. I also had to remember, and I said, I remember it now, literally still. When I hesitate, I have to go, no, it's in alphabetical order. It's paper towel. That's how I remember it. I feel blessed to be the child of immigrant parents. They have it just gives you a sense of value. My father's expression about I cried when I had no shoes till I met a man who had no feet was exactly the world that they lived in. And so I don't sweat the small stuff. I don't know. Okay. It's cool that it is. It's F-I-N-E, by the way, because a lot of fines are F-E-I-N. But ours is F-I-N-E. My father's name was Yankelevich, when he came to America, or in Europe. It was Yankelevich, and his first name is Jack, which in Yiddish is Yankel. So it's Yankel Yankelevich. And so I am so glad I don't have to write that out on all. Every time I write fine, I just thank somebody who changed it someplace and say, thank you, this is so fast. And my other friends will go and put Kowatsky and all of that crap. And so I don't know. There was an Uncle Feinthal who helped sponsor my father's grandmother when they came over. And he passed away when I was a kid, but I knew of the name. His name was Feinthal. And I would assume he just made it fine just to be simple, but not having people think we were his kids or something like that. I don't know. We're talking about family heritage. I would, have to mention the fact that I married a very nice lady who I met when I was in the advertising agency in the city, and we begat 2 little boys, David and Stephen, who were 2 years apart, who spent the first half of their life killing each other. Lynn and I got divorced at, I guess the boys were about 10, 12, but it was amicable. It was traumatic. It was more traumatic for my mother. Nobody had ever gotten divorced in their life, and the family, and this, and it was the 70s, or around the 80s, when everybody was getting divorced, because if you weren't happy, you should be happy. My parents' generation, you made your bed, you lie in it, and that's your life. You're not happy, wait for your husband to die. They were a nice couple. They were much more than tolerant of each other, and they also had different roles to play. And that time, he was the man, and she was the housewife who took care of the kids and kept it clean. And the women, first of all, financially, they weren't in a position to say, I don't want this marriage. It was just a whole other world. Everybody went into education in my family but me, pretty much. When I went to college, it was just not a thing. The guys, the girls were all going to be nurses, secretaries, teachers, airline stewardesses. I actually got a college scholarship because when I was 14, I got TB. I don't know how or what, but it was one of the more traumatic changes in my life. I was sent to a sanitarium, TB sanitarium, in Bergen County. I was away for 5 months, so I had tutors coming to teach me in the hospital, in the sanitarium. I was the youngest one there. The next oldest, I was 14. Next oldest one was 20, 22, and there were dozens of older people there, not dying, just isolated. Half of them might be what homeless people today, but they were in there. So I had quite an education as a kid. The tutors came, and because I had nothing else to do, I became a half-decent student. And because of that, the National TB Association or something had scholarships available for kids who'd had TB, and I assume, unfortunately, it's mostly children in poverty who get TB, and we weren't, but and a lot of them don't go on to college, so I took this test, and I got a full college scholarship. I might have been the only kid in America who took the damn test, but I got it. I have been very lucky. My parents lived. Dad died at the age of 86, and he was a hustler and a great guy, not a macho guy, just a great guy, until his heart started to deteriorate the last few years of his life. His battery was getting weaker, as he said. Mom lived 10 more years. And a really interesting thing about Mom, who I'm really glad you got to meet, a woman of her generation. She was quiet. They went out. Dad was the guy who talked. Dad was the guy who had the jokes. The women would just sit and talk to each other, maybe complain about the hubbies. And she became a whole different person. We would visit her a lot. My sisters and I would talk, and it was like having a 3-year-old in the house. We would call up at night and go, You want to hear what she said today? Do you want to know what they did? And it was so funny. She developed, first of all, maybe she always had, but we would go, Mom is funny. And really funny. I mean, she became a talker, and she didn't hesitate speaking her mind. Not that she was obnoxious, but it was great. The coolest comment was something said at her funeral. Michelle, my youngest sister, said the people at the independent facility, and they just checked on everybody, and they would contact the family if, hey, she seems to need shoes or whatever. And they told Michelle, and my mother was like 4'10" and shrinking by the time she was 96, even beyond, lower than that. But she was very top heavy. And so they told Michelle she needs a bra. You ought to get her a bra. Michelle said, thank you for telling me. Great. Michelle said, I took her to the nearest shop, mall, which had a Bloomingdale's. And they went in, and Michelle, at Mom's funeral, was saying, and we took her, and until we found one that we could stuff her into, and this and that. So the woman said, $80 or whatever the hell it was, which was a lot of money for a bra, I guess. I don't know. But whatever it was, Michelle said, the sales lady said, oh, that'd be $80 or whatever. And Mom, without missing a beat, my mother, without missing a beat, said, how much? I'm 93 years old. Can I rent one? and that's what Michelle said at Mom's funeral. And that was Mom. I mean, she just spoke to... That's the other thing I said at Dad's funeral. Kids were taught not to talk to strangers. Keep your opinions to yourself. We weren't. We were taught to talk to strangers because most of them are really nice and appreciate the human interaction. And now that I've got gray hair, I can talk to anybody, because if I was younger, people would clutch their pocketbook and all. Now, between being on a bicycle and having gray hair, I can stop and talk to just about anybody I feel like talking to on the street, and they'll be unoffended and unafraid. That's what good parents teach you. To get out there in society, appreciate life, stop bitching about the small stuff, and move on. Don't get stuck digging yourself into a hole that's not worth it. But education is probably something I would go into today if I had life to do over again. It's a lovely field. I really like talking. At this age, I don't hear that well. And years ago, kids had nice, simple names, Tom, Dick, and Harry. Today, I'd have a tough time memorizing everybody's name. But education's a beautiful field. Both my sisters and David, my son, and a lot of their kids are in education or will be. So there. Is that it? You have any more questions?
We're done.
Okay, I'm going to come back next week for a sequel.